So the title, Archives of Natural History, the speakers and the audience cross over between curatorial, museum and university research positions, and to address issues that concern archivists of all kinds. Now, the of natural history bit, just to say that natural history is a theme or an expression that we've addressed before, and I look back deep in the archive at what we've done before, and in the year 2000, we had a series on natural histories, which featured Doreen Massey, Bruno Latour, Sarah Watmore, Jan Penrose, and Mark Jenner. Now, sadly, I can't offer those in this term, but it was interesting looking at those seminars because I think many of them used the term natural history rather metaphorically and certainly politically and philosophically. But here we're interested in this term in the archives of a discipline, perhaps a field called natural history. So some of your ears, that term, natural history, might sound archaic, perhaps quaint, parochial, which in some ways it is, but of course it's also global because it refers us to a powerful knowledge formation, you might think of it as associated with empire and the state in the past. But it also connects us to large institutions today. In other words, natural history museums and collections. Final word about the title before we get to the speaker, and that is I must thank, with immense gratitude, Anne Secord for allowing me to steal the title of an actually existing journal, the Archives of Natural History. It will be known to some of you, to many of you. And so thanks to her and the journal for allowing us to use the title, and perhaps we might refer to that journal in discussion afterwards. So today's speaker then, I'll turn to introduce Dr. Diego Molina. Diego is a British Academy postdoc fellow at Royal Holloway in the Centre for Geohumanities, and also a visiting researcher at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. And recently, a year or so ago, a fellow in the Rachel Carson Centre for Environment and Society in Munich. He's come to his current work across a remarkable route across the world, across disciplines. He trained as a biologist in Medellin, Colombia, 15 years ago. He did a master's in geography in Bogota, did a PhD in Reading, awarded 2021. And all of that experience, that research experience, makes him what we in the UK call an early career researcher. Over this period, he's published widely, including 2 books and a third on the environmental history of Bogota, to be published this year. This book, the latest book, is the first in a new rounded series on gardens in history. And as some of you will know, he's published articles in various journals, environmental history, social and cultural geography, economic botany, and conservation biology, and has chapters in books on landscape architecture and urban nature. His British Academy Fellowship is on transatlantic plant exchange between European and Andean cities in the long 19th centuries. I think I would say it's as much about a history of cities as it is about a history of modern nature. It's a story of European plant hunters in the tropics, but also the reverse movement of European and other plants into South America. I really can't think of a better person to begin our series, Diego, given your experience across disciplines and your interest particularly in doing historical work in natural history collections, and that's his theme today, talking about archives and herbaria, more specifically the herbarium as an archive of human as well as natural history, which gives us the title that you may be able to see underneath that bar in front of you. And I'll read out the title in case you can't see it. Herbaria as places of with memory, researching transatlantic plant exchange in the 19th century. Over to you, Diego.
Thank you, Felix, for this quite nice presentation introduction. And thank you all for being here today. And thanks to the people also online. So as Felix mentioned, I will talk about my research on the exchange of plants between Latin America and Europe during the 19th century, but then I will do more a reflective part about how we can use herbaria to try to understand this historical process involving organisms, in my case, plants. So let me start for the last part, so introducing what I have been found so far in my research, and then I will move towards the the part of the herbarium, because that part will give us a context of the possibilities of natural history archive. So first, the transatlantic exchange, and then I want to ask you to see the pictures I'm going to show you, the images that are accompanying my presentation. Yeah. Not only as images, but also as historical sources. And this is important because that's going to give us a contrast when I address the possibilities offered by our archives as a herbarium as archives. So this is a very typical image we can find in the 19th century, but particularly by the end of the 19th century, people like from the emerging elite in the domestic spaces surrounded by plants posing in front of a camera. That was very common. And then if you track some of the plants in the images, you can see that many of these plants were coming from different plants around the world. Many of these plants were integrated into the roots, the trade routes that have been expanding with the British Empire expansion throughout the world. So back in those days, in the middle of the 19th century, the British Empire more or less controlled certain tropical areas, like in India, a little bit of Africa, and the Southeast Asia. But what happened with this region here is the tropical Andes, now we know, is one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. So the penetration of the British Empire there was not so as sharp as in other tropical environments. This was the place called La Nueva Granada, the viceroyalty of New Granada, which was under the control of the British Spanish crown until 1821. It was well known to have very rich environments for plants, and it was quite diverse. So the Spanish crown has already organized a botanical expedition, the expedition of Nueva Granada, which was headed by José Celestino Mutis, which collected a quite significant number of plants, as well as Alexander von Humboldt, that alongside Aim von Plant collected a lot of new species later described by Kuhn. So at this moment, in the transition between the 18th century to the 19th century, one of the biggest motivation was the economic possibilities of plants. And this is a clear example with the quina, the quinina, the cinchona species that became the center of the expeditions in the late 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. But later on, all you know, the cities start to grow in both sides of the Atlantic. The people moved to the cities, the conditions of life became worse, and this linked to the echoes, the resonance of the romantic thinking that seeing this lost paradise put plants in another perspective. These ideas of the romanticism mixed with the overcrowded and ill cities give the ornamental plants a new status. So now in this moment was not only important the plant that could make a crown can bring money to the crown of the Spanish, for example, but plants became popular as ornaments and as elements to create nice spaces. And this is quite important because then the richness of these plants in tropical Andes was kind of discovered for the growing horticultural societies by Jan Jules Linden, which knew the collections made by another botanist, Jose Jerónimo Triana, and based on these collections, he saw the potential of the plants growing in what we know today as Colombia and Ecuador, the tropical Andes, one of which is Anthurium andreanum, maybe one of the most popular ornamental plants you can find in Tesco or in any other place here in England. So he opened the vein of these ornamental plants. But what happened? Linden spent most of his early years after collecting plants trying to maintain these plants. And that's a critical point, because then after the establishment of the Crystal Palace, the construction of the Crystal Palace, the creation of greenhouses became cheaper, mainly because the cast iron technologies advanced and the reduction of taxes in glasses. Now the greenhouses became easy to get for the rich people that now could can have the access to all these plants described by Humboldt in the Andes if they have economic power to build greenhouses of different sorts, like greenhouses, stuff houses, binary houses, orangeries, and then they have to hire someone to design, and on the top of that have a plumber that manage to control the atmosphere that can create the conditions for these plants to survive. So this is the moment when really the plants became an object of ostentation, because the plant by itself was expensive, but what was more expensive was to keep them alive in England or in other cities or in Europe. Then who introduced these plants? It's something that many people know. Some small nurseries became bigger players of this transatlantic exchange, mainly between Latin America and Europe. So those ones are three of the main players: Bache, Benjamin Williams, and William Bull, became big corporations of enormous dimensions, of enormous size, because there was a big market for these plants as an object of ostentation. And one of the most important characteristics of these nurseries is that they manage to hire people that were sent to Latin America to collect plants to the tropical environments, and later on known as plant hunters. So the plant hunters were it was a character that was mainly emerged as a consequence of this travelage, of histories of travel that show them, in which they show themselves as very heroic, fighting the nature to collect these plants. But in reality, there were quite a diverse group of people, and many of them, and this is very important, had real interest for botany. They collect plants, but also alive plants, but also collect plants that ended up in the herbarium. And that's why I will show later the herbarium is also a very important source of information when we try to understand that. One of the main issues, or one of the main topics around these plant hunters, plant collectors, is the orchids, which basically dominated the market, was kind of the big part of this big market that was emerging in the 19th century. So it has been kind of well studied, but orchids were not the only plants, and this is important because many other plants were moved between Latin America and England and in Europe in general. So they moved plants like palms, also trees, vines, aquatic plants. So it was a big movement of different kind of plants that not only encompasses orchids. And this is quite important for the research I'm trying to undertake in the herbarium. And another point that has been quite underestimated is that this movement of plants happened in both directions. We know that all these plant hunters, plant collectors moved to Latin America and sent a lot of plants to Europe, but at this point, during the last part of the 19th century, the Latin American countries, the Latin American cities were in process of modernization. So they opened ports, built roads, and ideas about the city, about how to live and build the city were introduced into Latin America. And that's quite important because then with these ideas, the elites transformed cities like Quito, like this Quito of the late 19th century, of this Bogota of the 19th century, into places with green spaces. And for building these green spaces, they introduced a significant number of plants that were not native. So they built these gardens, but also promenades. And you might think that they use this kind of plants that naturally grow around Bogota, which is kind of a natural garden. This is a picture I took in one of the old fieldworks there in the moorlands in the Páramos. So basically, this is a garden, but they use these plants. The answer is not, and then they rely on merchants, plant merchants from Europe. So these nurseries imported plants from all around the world, including South America, and then they send them back to Latin America or tropical environment because the elites in Latin America see in these plants an instrument, a raw material to build civilized cities. And this is important. The plants growing there wild, they were not suitable for the aims they have. So the nurseries create also catalogs in Spanish for selling their plants in the other side of the Atlantic. And importantly, they send people not to hunt plants, but to sell plants. And then these plant merchants sell the plants in newspapers, in magazines, and they have lobbyists. They go there and talk to the mayors, trying to sell the plants for the decoration of the ornamentation of the cities. And also, there is something I found in the archives in Colombia. The diplomats play a very important role here because they introduce plants trying to emulate the landscape they have at home. And here, this is one of the list of the things that Mr. Philip Griffith and the British Consul in Bogota introduced in Bogota in 1859. And one important thing is the guardian case. We have been thinking that the guardian case move plants from tropical environments, neotropical environments to paleotropical, like sugarcane, like the case of rubber. But also they were used, this was an artifact used to introduce plants to Latin America, something we don't really know. He introduced seeds, another box of plants, and usually, as happened with the diplomats, he introduced a lot of wine. So this is more or less like, okay, and then the result of this is like cities in the high altitude Andes start to seem more like Europe than the environments they were located. So this is more or less what I've been researching, the findings. I ask you to pay attention to the sources because these images are historical sources, because all these images are examples of the historical sources any environmental historian or historical geographer can use to produce history, to reconstruct historical processes. But then, because I was trained as a botanist, I say, let's try to find information in the herbarium. And now I'm going to share with you my experience trying to use the herbarium or herbariums or herbarium in general as a source of information. And the first thing is that I discovered those places are places with a lot of memory, but places with memories also. But the first thing I want to share with you is that when you want to use the herbarium, this natural history archives, you need to understand that it's completely different to what you used to do as a historian, as a geographer. When you are a historian, you go to an archive, let's say the National Archive, and you go there, you see in the catalog, and you try to find something it's going to be useful for you. This information is already filtered by someone that produces a catalog. In the herbarium, there are no catalogs. They are, but they are quite incomplete. So then you need to go there, and you are in the archive. You are physically in the archive. It's an immersive, a real immersive experience. And then you are there, and you need to know the organization of the archive. In this case, the herbarium. The herbariums are organized trying to mimicking the taxonomical relationships of plants, something that historians don't have idea, because it's quite complicated. So when I studied botany, they taught me that the relationship between plants were structured according to Arthur Cronquist. Later, new technologies, phylogenetic molecular technologies came, and now herbariums are organized according to something called APG. So herbariums change, but they have tried to resemble the evolutive transformation of plants. So this is tricky, but usually there is someone in a herbarium that might help you with that, willingly or not. And then it's easy if you are in a small herbarium in Latin America, in a very tiny one. But if you are in a colonial herbarium, they sit you there for an hour and a half, and they explain you everything, and you don't understand, but you need to write. And those are my notes about how to navigate the herbarium. It's complicated. Roughly, they give you, like, in these wings, you have these plants. You need to understand with plants. Then you go to the red book. You check the number of the family. Once you localize the number of the family, you go to the first cabinet of the family, and then you check the genus of the family. After checking the genus of the family, you go to the map, which has a number, which represents the region you are studying. Very easy. So this is more or less the tools you need to use to navigate Q. This is Q. All the herbariums are completely different, but this is Q. So the red book, the book with the families, and the map. The problem here is that most of the people that visit herbariums are taxonomists. The 99% of people visiting herbariums are taxonomists. So when you go there as a taxonomy, you are an expert in legumes, Gesneriaceae, orchids, whatever. And then they give you a space like this, and you are sitting there, you are collecting, you are checking your plants, changing names, everything, it's normal. But because I am not interested in one species, and I'm not interested in palms, in orchids, but in a whole movement of plants, that's why I show you these plant collectors, not only collected plant orchids, it's very important. I need to move through the herbarium. And then what happens is you find yourself in a labyrinthic-like space full of boxes, small spaces, some with lights, different kind of shelves, go up, go down. In Q, the floors are not like this, but they are like this. So you go up half floor, then go down. It's a mess. And then you have a lot of things you don't know, a lot of information on the walls of the herbarium. And this shows how the herbarium works. It's quite interesting. It's like an ethnographic thing about the herbarium. So this is digitizing process, but then you have, please don't do this. They have list of genus like the legumes, and they have this, be careful, cuidado microscopio. And the one I really like the most is this one, the argonite thing, which shows you that you might die if there's fire in Q, because if there is fire, they are going to extinguish the fire with argonite or argonite, I don't know, argonite, but they will suffocate you in the process. You are unimportant, basically. So you need to know all these things. Then when you realize more or less how to navigate the herbarium, you finally open the cabinet in which you are hoping to find some information, and then you keep finding labels. The herbarium is the universe of labels, are labels for everything. But then you move, and then the magic starts to happen, because then you start to discover that herbariums can be also archives of different kind of memories. For example, I start to discover very recently in the herbarium at Kew, the collections of Frederick Karl Lehmann, which was a German-Polish person that moved to Colombia, collected a lot of orchids, and ended up being the son-in-law of the president of Colombia. So it was quite an important person. This, as many others, he died in very mysterious conditions, drowned in a river. It's not mysterious, it's because he was related with the political people. But one of the things that caught my attention is the place he was collecting orchids. He collected in a town called La Plata in Tolima. La Plata in Spanish, in English, means silver. This town is called Silver, and this is something that you find recurrently with the plant collectors. They were not just going there in the jungle like randomly. They followed the miners, and many of them were also miners. That's why the name of La Plata confirmed this process in which the first Englishmen arrived, opened mines, and then the plant collectors came later. If you go to the herbarium, you discover also that many collections are come with letters, with a lot of information that actually transform these vouchers, as we call the herbarium collections, into really pieces of information, historical information. This is one from William Purdy, one of the initial plant collectors that followed Linden very early, before the boom of that happened after 1851, and he was describing how he find this species, the people that helped him. So, for example, here he was disappointed because one of these plants was not as purple as bright as he imagined. And also, these other things, these other collectors, I have found them in letters, in the archive in Kew, but also in the archives in Colombia and in Ecuador. So there are links, but in the archive, in the herbarium as an archive, I start to find things that I haven't seen before. And one of them is this Miss Tracy, which later on I dig a little bit more. I discover she was like an English woman that was in charge of collecting plants. But this was quite, this shows people that are not visible in the main archives. For example, women that were kind of not very evident, but also shows a different kind of silence. And this is important because herbariums, or the collections in herbariums, keep the same silence, gaps, biases that any other archive have. For example, here we know that Miss Tracy collected this Puya, this bromelia. Then I went to see the place, and the place is more or less like this. So it's kind of difficult to picture a young English woman going here by the end of this is already beginning of the 20th century, collecting plants by herself. So for sure, someone helped her to collect those plants. And those silence are very constant in the herbariums. We have here one very later example of the plant collected by Andrew Archer from North American, that in which he describes some ethnobotanical uses of this paper, but we don't know who gave him this information. We have a lot of silences, and silences, like all we know, are very bright. They are very talkative in a way. And then you have a plant memories, which is in the herbarium. You can see like the history of the plants, and something which became quite important when I start to see the herbarium as an archive is the importance of the types. The types are the template in which every species is contrasted with. It's like the template for naming a species. It is very well known for botanists. But this kind of memory of the species, this is the history of every species, not the organism, but the idea we have of the plant, the species. Have problems, amnesias, problem of continuities. For example, this, checking many plant collectors were from Germany, and they put, at the end, the collections ended up in Berlin, but the herbarium was bombed during the Second War, and now we have the types are pictures. So the memory of the plant was transformed, suffered like a transmutation of shape, and now instead of a plant, we have a picture. And the same happened, for example, with this type of Samia elegantissima, which is a plant that we don't know who collected. We know it come from Colombia, but it was in charge by William Bull, the owner of this big nursery. And the type of this plant doesn't have a collector, and doesn't have any location. And it's tricky because they wanted to name the plant, but also they want to keep the secret of the location of the plant. So we have a type of the plant, like the main memory of the plant, that we cannot recognize really in the real world. And we have also the history of the plants, of the introduction of plants. This is a collection of Jose Jerónimo Triana, the botanist on which Linden based his collections, from Almaguer in the south of Colombia in 1853, that shows how this plant, very common plant in Europe, was introduced in Colombia by them, and also some uses. So what is important here is that through the botanical collections, you can see the moment in which plants were introduced to a place, or the earlier moment. So you have the memory of the type of the species, also the geographical distribution of the plant, but also something that I start to discover is that the mobility of these plants not only occur in the shape of like a live plant, but also as a collection. Ready collections were moving from Europe to Latin America. This is something I didn't expect when I start to check this transatlantic exchange of plants. And then later I discovered that some plants arrived to Colombia already, like vouchers of herbarium. So, for example, this is the first collection of one small herbarium in Medellin, and it's from the Alps from 1821. Something very strange. We don't know the real origin of this plant, which some of plants came from distant places like Denmark. So the exchange of plants were not only motivated by this desire of ornamental plants in both sides of the Atlantic, but also by a genuine curiosity. And we have, I discovered recently a very interesting case of this movement of botanical collection between Europe and Latin America. And this is, for example, the case of Cliporium arbensis, a very common plant in Europe that it's in a herbarium in Medellin, sold by this person as Emily he made a business of selling vouchers of herbariums. So that's why when you see there the herbarium, they don't have the name of the herbarium. So he sold this collection, and then when you buy it, you put herbario, whatever. And he made quite a lot of money, apparently. And then when you carry on, you check the collection, something that is really interesting for me as a botanist also, is that you see the engagement with people, with plants. So all the people that you know from books or people that put names, that how they leave traces in every collection. So you see, for example, people that put a name and then they change their opinion, but then 20 years later, they came back to the original name, or you see the disputes between botanists. One expert put the name and then another one changed the name. It's quite interesting. And then you see, for example, what plants that have been misnamed for ages, for more than 100 years, like lemon, again, the son-in-law of the president, that first named this as Aristolochia and ended up being a Dioscorea. So there are empty spaces, there are gaps, but also you see the evolution of how people have been moved in describing the plants, for example, the labels that shows not only the evolution of the knowledge, but also the technology and the uses we can of the information you can get from the botanical collection. So you see here, for example, molecular information, anatomical preparation, and all the processes that are involved in the herbarium. So you see a lot of stamp signs, codes that shows history, time passing through every collection you check. And this is very short, is that through the collections, you also can indirectly check the history of places. You need to have a more ecological perspective here. But for example, here, this is a grass, semi-aquatic grass collected also by Jose Jerónimo Triana that was collected in the banks of the San Francisco River in Bogotá. This grass is quite difficult to find nowadays in Bogotá, mainly because of the hydraulic infrastructure. So plants can tell us how the environment has been changing. And then now they are planning to put gardens around all this area. So all these native plants were transformed into gardens. And some also early introductions like Arum italicum, a plant from Europe that became quite common in abandoned plots in Bogotá. So it started to be part of the landscape. So we can kind of trace the history, small places of the small parts of the history of the landscape through the collections of plants. And this is one example that gather all what I have been telling you about the memories of plants, memories of collection, memories of places, is the collection of Samia obliqua, also from Colombia, that has a lot of information in these papers in the voucher. And you see like people sending letters that try to find the origin of the plants. And also you can see the main players that I mentioned to you already. So actually the collection is it's a piece of a historical, it's a historical source. And finally, so when you go to the herbarium, you see when you walk there that pass the time pass, and then you see a lot of kind of traces of the past. You see things that have been abandoned. You see pictures. You see that the herbariums are very kind of have places with a real memory that are kind of alive. And you see traces, for example, the fingerprints of someone in this collection of Samia that might be there for 100 years or 20 days, I don't know, but someone passed before me and left some traces. And this is quite interesting because you walk in the herbarium in queue and you see ancient ways of always of memorizing or creating memories, organizing the history, and you see this kind of cabinets with information about the plants that not many of us use. So it's also the history of how plants and libraries or any other archives were organized, but are still there. They are still there as traces of the past. And also you have a lot of chaos, noise, forgotten elements, people die and abandon the collections. It's herbariums are not only places of order, but also of chaos. And that's quite interesting because then arise question marks. Nobody knows this. That's why I was telling you that labels are the most important element in herbariums. And also the memory can be affected by non-humans. If we are talking about the human memory, non-humans are also undermined, and we have to fight the insects that affect our way we organize and remember our past with plants. In some herbariums, like this one in Medellin, they have also insects, but because they were infected by fungus. So the herbarium, this is very important. They are not only the house for plants, but also for fungus, animals, and other things. Finally, when you walk in the herbarium, you see kind of the persistent inequalities. And this is, for example, how they make digital images in Colombia, in one herbarium in Colombia, in comparison to the digitalizing equipment in Kew. It's quite evident. And this process of digitizing the collection will kind of reduce these gaps of inequalities, but also it's something I feel, for example, in the British Library, it's going to stop us to have like unwanted encounters. It's like, I don't go there and I know what I'm going to find. When I walk through the herbarium and I see, oh, Samias, I open the shelf, the cabinet, and I discover things. But if everything is outside my reach, my hands, I won't be able to have this kind of encounters, unexpected encounters. Although if you have access, you will have more access to a vast number of collections. And finally, I want to highlight this kind of coincidence between the word or the recolección in Spanish and recollection in English. Recolección in Spanish is gather objects or people from diverse origins, while in English, although the word came from the same root, recollection usually tend to be, at least I found that is a memory of something or the ability to remember things. And that's why if you combine these two meanings, collecting plants, recollecting in the Spanish way, is also a way of creating memory. That's why moving the herbarium, the cube, is wrong. It's not a good idea to move the herbarium because it's going to undermine the memory, not only of the English, the history of the good things and the bad things of the history of England, of the UK, but also memories involving other people, other non-humans, and the memories of people working there today. And that's all. Thank you very much.